next time. Okay. Happy New Year, everyone. This is our continuation of the Ruyer reading group, where we're continuing our reading of Cybernetics and the Origin of Information. We're still on chapter 2, towards the end of the chapter. I think we may finish it today. So we're picking up on page 55. Slight confusion starting out today about where exactly we finished last time. We may be rereading a little bit to pick up from the end of where we were last time. But yeah, nothing wrong with going over things a second time. And right, so the title of the chapter is Framing Activities and Framed Mechanisms. And this is sort of like the basic duality in Ruyer's approach to mechanisms in general, or like the relationship between conscious actions or the actions that are brought about by a conscious being, like a human being, for instance. Although he also sees certain biological processes as having this nature, and then on the other hand, the mechanisms that result from this. So in the case of these, like one of the examples that he talks about is one, this, I can't remember exactly who introduced it, but it's something that cyberneticians talked about, is this man in the middle process where you have like the operator of an anti-aircraft gun, for example. You have a radar device so this is obviously a machine that receives electromagnetic signals that vary depending on what is in the surrounding area, and then that signal is transduced into a representation on a screen that a human operator can use to identify whether there are objects flying around in the area surrounding the radar installation, and then obviously have to determine is that object an enemy bomber plane, or is it a flock of geese? Because your response is obviously going to be very different depending on how you interpret that dot on your screen. And then when the person makes that determination about what this dot represents, then they make a decision and I don't know, press a button or pull a lever or whatever, and either launch the nuclear missiles and destroy the world, or they I don't know, set off some anti-goose device, I guess, to scare the geese away. Whatever setup is there. But in any case, you have this like chain of mechanisms leading in that transmit the information from the electromagnetic waves being reflected off of this object, all the way to the screen that the operator views. And then you have the person in the middle, and then you have another chain of mechanisms that leads away from the person to some sort of effect produced by pulling the lever or pressing the button or whatever it is. So this is like you have, like in this case, you have the machines on both ends of the chain of the whole sort of process. You have machines at the start, a person in the middle, and then machines at the end. And so here the machines are sort of framing the person. And this kind of chain or this kind of sequence allows you to replace that person. Often you can actually get better results by replacing the person with a machine. The machine won't get tired, or I don't know, decide that maybe nuclear war is a good idea. We should start a nuclear war just for fun. The machine will just sort of do what it's supposed to do in a reliable way, as long as the sort of background conditions are adequate, that it's not overheating or whatever. However, what Ruyer wants to sort of point out is that even in this case, where we have this chain where the machine is on the outside, this chain is always sort of embedded in a larger chain where a human being is on the outside of the chain, or human decision making is sort of in framing the chain made up of machines and possibly human decisions intertwined with it. So in the case of this like anti-aircraft gun installation, someone had to decide, first of all, that defending our country against enemy bombers is an important thing to do. And secondly, that this location is a good place to put up a radar installation to ensure that we can identify enemy bomber planes, etc. Like all these decisions had to be made to bring about the actual construction of this radar installation at this place, and to have a person trained and assigned the task of operating this radar installation, etc. All these human decisions had to be performed before the chain with or without a person in the middle could ever be set up. And what he kind of insists on throughout this chapter is that all these little devices, like the artificial tortoise that we talked about in previous sessions, that the cyberneticians kind of point to as like examples of how you could replace the sort of the role of the person. These are all instances of the first type of chain with a person in the middle, where like decision making is like sort of included in a chain of machines, coming in and going out. But they always sort of neglect the fact that there's actually a person setting up that chain in the first place. So like in the case of the artificial tortoise, I think I mentioned this like last time or in the last couple sessions, that like the fact that the light sources are a reliable indication of where the charging stations for this artificial tortoise are, like just the structure of this environment is something that has to be set up by the person in like designing the experiment. And so this sort of seemingly goal-directed behavior or seemingly like adaptive behavior of the tortoise in seeking out the charging station that allows it to recharge its battery is only possible because the environment is set up in this way. So if you just like moved the light sources to some other location that wasn't attached to the charging stations, then the artificial tortoise would like direct itself away from the charging station and towards the light, and then just deplete its battery and die. So it would not be at all adaptive. It would not have any capacity to sort of recognize, oh, the light source is no longer leading me towards the charging station, so I should stop following the light source. I should use some other signal to identify where the charging station is so that my battery doesn't deplete. That would be like something more analogous to a living being that sometimes uses signals like that light source. So there are organisms that seek out light or avoid light, but are also to varying degrees capable of learning that what was previously a reliable indication of something to seek out or something to avoid no longer has that value, and they have to change their approach to that indication. So like many even like quite simple organisms will move up a gradient of a certain chemical that is a sign of the proximity of a food source. So if they detect that the concentration of this chemical is increasing in a certain direction, they will move in that direction, and normally this leads them towards a food source that they can consume. But if you sort of set up the environment in like an artificial setting in such a way that this is not actually a reliable signal of where the food source is, and maybe something else like a light gradient or I don't know a sound or whatever is a better indication of where the food source is, then some animals will actually learn to ignore the smell or taste or whatever concentration gradient of chemical concentration gradient, and instead use the light gradient as their way of navigating towards the food source. Whereas, of course, the machines can only follow what they have been built to do. They have certain preset ways of operating, and so you could add like another layer to your artificial tortoise that allows it to learn. Don't follow the light source. Follow I don't know, a radar detection device instead. But you would have to sort of build that in to the machine. You wouldn't be able to give it sort of this open-ended learning ability that some animals have, to varying degrees. And so that's sort of like the bigger picture of this chapter is just this distinction between just sort of insisting on the fact that this open-ended capacity to adapt is always sort of presupposed by all these more restricted forms of adaptation that, in some cases are fairly impressive. This artificial tortoise seems to be doing something similar to like a simple organism, kind of adapting to its environment, but it's only capable of doing that because that more open-ended sort of capacity to set goals and achieve them that human beings have was already sort of presupposed in setting up the environment in this way. So that's sort of like the bigger picture of the argument in this chapter. Okay, so let's start reading from page 55 at the heading break, if someone would like to pick up from there.
I can read. Science and the frame. Science is much more at ease in explaining the mechanical or semi-mechanical median region of actions than in understanding their origin and end. Doctrines such as existentialism, psychological conceptions that address the I, quote-unquote I, such as those of William Stern or Mary W. Calkins, and biological or psychological vitalist theories are hardly welcomed. The same is true for Platonic or Husserlian philosophies of essence, for axiology, or for the theory of organic types. In short, science neglects everything that is quote-unquote framing, whether it is the quote-unquote agent or the quote-unquote ideal. When there are several nested quote-unquote means, for example, when the operation of an auxiliary device is itself nested in the half-operating action of the psychological set, this, quote, law of negligence, unquote, is even more striking. The more, quote-unquote, central the means, the clearer and more scientifically accessible they are. There is nothing clearer than the operation of a thermostat, an elevator, a directional gyrosperry, or a slide rule. The operation of a physiological set is already more difficult to understand. Even more difficult is the action of a psychological task. The psychologists at the Würzburg school, like the psychoanalysts, have been accused of pseudoscience. Finally, the action or nature of the will, of the quote-unquote I or of the organic X, the intentional relationship of the quote-unquote I to an ideal, is quite mysterious. So we understand that science has always tried to interpret the framing elements, 1 and 4, starting from the framed elements, 2 and 3, the encompassing actions starting from the auxiliary functioning encompassed. Cybernetics is only the latest, most precise, and most interesting to reduce the whole quote-unquote framing to auxiliary functioning. And yet, only instinctive or voluntary motivations give meaning and possibility to auxiliary assemblies. Isolated assemblies make no sense and are literally nothing. The automata of cybernetics, having no motivation, are not beings. Gray-Walter's automata are pure passages from stimulus to response, while real beings go toward their goal by way of means and obstacles. Automata actually operate according to a framing will, that of their constructor. They are auxiliary machines for the constructor, like all man-made machines, and it is absurd to use an auxiliary as a model to understand the autonomous being. The mechanical causal sequence from 2 to 3, and the causal and thematic sequence of the psychological set, which is at the same time a, quote, push a tergo, unquote, and an, quote, orientation toward an optimum, unquote, from 1A to 3A, imply the finalist action 1 through 4. The mechanical sequence is without consciousness. The action of the psychological set is subconscious, but the whole is set up by intentional consciousness. In the experiments with Dr. Ashby's homeostat, the set is represented by the various adjustments of the assemblies. Dr. Ashby makes a mistake of vocabulary or designation on this subject that appears unimportant, but which is of great consequence for philosophical interpretation. He considers the interventions of the experimenter as representing the, quote, modifications of the environment, unquote, and the rest of the apparatus is representing the brain that has to adapt to these modifications. This is a serious confusion. The environment and its changes often impose a task, quote-unquote, task on us. For example, the lowering of the temperature imposes on us the task of raising the thermostat's temperature, thermostat's thermometer. But it is the living being himself who must, quote, rise to the task, unquote, in order to respond to the change. The brain is therefore represented by the entire homeostat, including various assemblies, and not only by the part of the apparatus that responds to the constraints that the experimenter imposes on the other part. Consciousness is represented by the intervening experimenter, which means that it is not explained at all by the apparatus. It is precisely the action of taking on the task imposed by the environment. Taking on a task through a set is not the same as being subjected to it. Yeah, so part of the point here seems to be that it's just easier to understand the framed elements than it is to understand or easier to just easier to study and explain, either the machines that are used in the I guess finalist action, or the mechanical physical aspects that are used in the action, and more difficult to understand the kind of axiological aspect, the basically finalist intention that is represented by 1 and 4 in this this model that Ruyer has given us. And I think that Ruyer sees the functioning of these machines as sort of like these physiological or psychophysiological sets. So they really only operate in order to bring about some goal for which they have been designed in the first place. And it's the goal that kind of, that gives the unity to the machine, and machine sort of borrows the purpose of the inventor. And the functioning of the machine, as we've discussed, has to be sort of supplemented at points by some, inventor or operator who is human, or, is a living being who can keep the goal in mind and kind of regulate the machine when it starts malfunctioning.
Yeah, I think even before you get to like the sort of supplementation side of things, that like there's already the question of like, why is the machine set up in this way in the first place? So in the case of like the thermostat, you have a machine that's set up to maintain the temperature at a certain level or within a certain range. And this you can this could be a replacement for a person. You could have like a person who stands next to the furnace with looking at a thermostat, or looking at a thermometer, and shoveling more coal in when the thermometer goes down, and opening the vent when the thermometer goes up, and just sort of constantly trying to keep the temperature in a certain range. It's like not a very rewarding task, but many tasks that people were assigned throughout human history have not been especially rewarding. This is something you could assign your servant to do, but then if you replace that servant with a machine, you probably get a more reliable temperature maintenance function, and it probably costs you less as well. But of course, someone had to decide that maintaining the temperature at a certain level was a goal that was worth pursuing in the first place, and either assign a person to do it or set up a machine that would perform that function. So you could instead, decide that constantly increasing temperature is the goal you want to pursue, and so have the servant just shovel more coal into the furnace at all times, or have you can't really call it a thermostat anymore, but have some sort of device that constantly increases the temperature of the furnace. Or you could, this sounds like American environmental policy. Or and the decision that it's this range in particular that you want to keep it at, 22 degrees, or sort of the normal, what we consider room temperature. You could decide, I want to keep my house at 10 degrees Celsius instead. I'm trading myself to live in a post-apocalyptic society where there's no more internal heating, and I want to keep my house at a colder temperature instead. For whatever reason, you could just decide that you're going to set the temperature of your thermostat to a different temperature, or set it to 40 degrees Celsius because you want to prepare for our climate change-induced future, where the whole world, or where your region is going to be a much higher air temperature. So yeah, you had to, or someone at some point had to decide, I'm going to set the thermostat at this level, or I'm going to put a thermostat in this building in the first place. And And so this is where sort of the role of consciousness intervenes for Ruyer. Is not so what the sort of mistake that he's criticizing Ashby for is like having consciousness be only inside the mechanism. Like the consciousness for Ashby is like the servant that is shoveling coal into the furnace when they notice the thermostat declining, and here consciousness is just sort of like you have the stimulus or this input of the thermostat is below the target level, and then you have a response which is shovel more coal into the furnace, and this is what and consciousness is just sort of like this like thing for filling in the gap in this circuit, but this is something that can easily be replaced by a machine because you can just have a thermostat that does the same thing. But that sort of obscures the fact that someone had to either assign this task to the servant or set up the thermostat. And this is like the much more important role of consciousness that Ruyer wants to insist on is like making that decision that maintaining temperature in this particular region is a goal that is worth pursuing, and here's how I intend to ensure that goal is realized. Yeah, exactly. So Bat's put here. Yeah, so being able to realize or decide that there is a problem to solve at all is precisely where consciousness seems to come into play primarily. Yeah. So yeah, you have to. So Ashby is already sort of starting from the point where the goals are set, and even most of the like mechanism that's going to realize this goal is set, and consciousness only intervenes in like plugging in some of the gaps that like are left behind, where one piece of the mechanism doesn't connect with the other, and you have to like hire your servant to shovel coal into the furnace. But this is like so it's not the case that consciousness can't do that, but that is sort of a secondary role of consciousness that presupposes the sort of prior form of consciousness, which is like deciding that keeping the temperature steady is something worth pursuing in the first place. So this is what he wants to sort of like shift our attention away from this sort of consciousness as plugging a gap in the ongoing sequence of machines towards like consciousness as setting up that sequence of machines in the first place, to achieve a certain goal. Okay, so yeah, we can go on to the next bit, the axiological frame. Bats, would you like to read from there? I think this might be the end of the chapter, actually. Yeah, it takes us to the end of the chapter.
Okay, yeah, I can read. The axiological frame. It is remarkable, however, that the most positivist value theorists, such as Stephen G. Pepper, who claims to be a follower of Ralph Barton Perry, and Edward C. Tolman, are led to schemas very similar to those we have proposed. In order to describe a real activity, for example that of the aviator who, after falling into the sea, is hungry in his dinghy and sets out to catch fish, Pepper insists on the need to clearly distinguish the quote-unquote governing propensity, here hunger that seeks to achieve a state of appeasement, acquiescence pattern, and subordinate acts, here fishing, tending towards a defined goal object, the fish as food. This gives the following schema. We have here a schema in 3 parts. On the left side we have the governing propensity, which has 2 parts in it, tendency and the anticipating set. Then in the middle we have the subordinate acts, and then on the right we have the goal, which itself divides into 2, the goal object and then the state of appeasement. The operation of the hook or net can itself be regulated in quote-unquote subordinate acts. However, according to Pepper, the quote-unquote governing propensity is clearly the primary dynamic factor in the whole structure of action. The subordinate acts, and we will add the mechanical operations used, are subordinate to the quote-unquote anticipatory set, which itself depends on the drive, just as the goal object is subordinate to the quiescence pattern, and the value of the fish as an object is subordinate to the value of quote-unquote appeasing hunger. A machine can imitate quote-unquote subordinate acts. It can even contain, as we have seen, the approximate equivalent of the anticipatory set, and reach the goal object by itself. But it is inconceivable that a machine encompasses the governing propensity and the quiescence pattern, and that it is an autonomous source of value or of value awareness. And yet, It is quite clear that value and awareness come first here, in relation to framed operations. Let us try to adopt the hypothesis of cybernetics and consider man acting as a pure automatic machine. What do we gain from this hypothesis? We simply push back the problem by making it more acute. If the man who, desiring to be warmer, raises the thermometer of the boiler, is still himself like a mechanical device, if the desire, quote-unquote, to be warm is materially inscribed in his brain, as the temperature he desires is materially inscribed in the device, and if this desire is nothing other than the material inscription, then by whom is it written? By which super engineer or super user? If the engineer is the same in principle as his automata, then who is the engineer who made the engineer? We do not claim that there is not, in the brain, at the moment when it performs a defined task, a material arrangement regulating the action of its nervous feedback. But the active establishment of the set is necessarily a characteristic of the real being, of which the visible brain is the appearance or the organ. If the action itself, 1 to 4, is in reality only a mechanical operation, it will be necessary to have recourse to a god, or rather to a demiurge, childishly imagined as an engineer and manufacturer. If on the contrary it is accepted, in accordance with the facts, that each of the nesting systems differs qualitatively from the nested systems, that the psychological set is different from the mechanical assembly, and that the conscious intention in turn differs from the psychological set, then we will have a means of glimpsing through a kind of qualitative extrapolation the nature of what frames the activity of man and of all living beings.
Actually, we can stop here. Yeah, sorry, I
Okay.
underestimated how much time we had left, or how much there was left in this section. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a bit long.
Yeah. This bit about the engineer thing is kind of important here, I think, because this is sort of like the typical, I guess, sort of debate that you have like between sort of creationists and evolutionary theorists, where the creationist says like, oh, this is I don't know, say like the vertebrate eye is too complicated to have evolved through natural selection, so someone had to have designed it. But again, that as Ruyer points out here, this just sort of pushes the problem back one step further, because then you have if you have some intelligent being that is designing vertebrates' eyes, then the question is is that intelligent being is even more complicated than a vertebrate eye. So that intelligent being would itself have to have been designed by an even more intelligent being. Of course, the sort of intelligent design is sort of like a sort of disguised version, a way of presenting just a purely religious argument, where you just sort of skip the whole step of engineer and super engineer, and you go straight to God as the explanation. But the sort of alternate way of doing things that Ruyer is trying to sort of steer us towards is kind of avoiding getting away from the mechanism with an engineer sort of picture, that if you only ever consider living beings as mechanisms, then you are sort of there's a sort of natural tendency to want to find an engineer that set up this mechanism, and the I guess standard Darwinian picture is a mechanistic picture that asserts that you can get away with just machines all the way down with no engineers, and obviously has had a lot of success in explaining a lot of different elements of the development of living beings over evolutionary history, without having to appeal to an engineer that had designed the machines or the mechanisms that make up those living beings. But what Ruyer is kind of suggesting here is that this can only get us so far, and this sort of temptation to see an engineer behind it is always going to recur. If we only ever think of living beings as mechanisms, then even at the level of molecular biology, for example, you have the way that certain codons in DNA in all living beings that we have identified, correspond to particular amino acids that are used to construct proteins. And what's pretty incredible about this is that the pairing is like seemingly arbitrary, that like there's no reason why this precise sequence of codons would correspond to this particular amino acid. It seems like it should be possible to, restructure it in a different way. But then at the same time, this seemingly arbitrary sequence is present in all living beings, animals, plants, fungi, bacteria, etc. So like this is something that some like intelligent design people that are like a little bit more sophisticated point to this to say, oh, this is like a sign that this designer sort of intervened right at the beginning to set up this alphabet of like this sort of genetic alphabet, and then sort of started the evolution machine going from there, and everything sort of progressed from there. So like if you only ever look at the machine aspect, or you only ever look at living beings as machines, then there will always be some like either gaps in the middle that someone will be able to say, oh, you need an engineer to plug this gap, or like the sort of outset of the machines, like the starting point, setting up the genetic alphabet, for example. This is something that requires an engineer to get the whole thing going, and he wants us to sort of shift away from that like machine picture that kind of always leaves the hope of finding an engineer at the end of the whole thing, or the beginning, I guess, and sort of look at the way that living beings actually are kind of, I mean, to the extent that living beings are machines, that there certainly are machines in living beings, or mechanisms in living beings. They're entities that bring about their own machines, and this is quite different than the engineer who picks up some materials and turns them into a machine to achieve their goals. So this is it's a kind of autonomous turning into a machine, as opposed to heteronomous being made into a machine. Yeah. So the question that Bats has brought up in the chat here is whether this is a sort of necessity. This engineer idea is a necessity. Could you not? So like I mentioned in the case of like Darwinian evolution. I mean, Darwin himself was not sort of a purist in terms of his natural selection arguments. Like he thought there were other forms of evolution going on. But if you have like a sort of purist Darwinian approach to evolution, the only thing that's going on is natural selection. Certain organisms are more likely to reproduce than others, and the traits that affect the likeliness to reproduce are at least partially heritable. And then the consequences is that the traits that increase the likelihood of reproducing are going to become more common in the population. And this is that's all there is to it. It's just the sort of statistical properties of sets of machines that we happen to identify as living beings, and that's the whole explanation for the whole history of life. Yeah, so it does seem like this is sort of consistent. There's no contradiction in this picture, but there are again, that sort of genetic alphabet fact is kind of it seems arbitrary in this picture. And this is something. So Jacques Monod, for example, important. I believe he won the Nobel Prize. French molecular biologist. One of his big sort of popularization books was called Chance and Necessity, and so his whole sort of framework for understanding biology is you have these sort of chance events that get sort of crystallized, I guess, into the later development of biology, and then you have the necessity through the sort of operation of evolution, and so this genetic alphabet would just be this sort of chance occurrence that for whatever reason the initial the first self-reproducing organism had its its sort of molecular machinery set up in such a way that that this sequence of codons in the DNA what corresponded to this amino acid, and it just sort of preserved that evolutionary accident over the whole course of the multi-billion year evolution of life. So that's consistent. I don't think there's any contradiction in that picture, but it's also not that satisfying to say that this sort of basic element that we find in every single living organism that we've ever encountered is just an accident that happened billions of years ago and just never got changed. it sort of it's not very satisfying, and it also sort of leaves open the possibility of suggesting, well, maybe it's not an accident, maybe it's this engineer that set things up this way for a reason that we don't understand, or maybe no reason at all. But in any case, it's not just an accident; it's the result of a decision of some kind. And to the extent that this sort of mechanistic Darwinian picture was supposed to replace the need to appeal to a creator that would have designed each species or each type of organism, it kind of it does sort of remove the need for this individual design of each species, but it still sort of kind of pushes back the problem to like the starting up the whole history of life in the first place. You can't really like decisively shut down the appeal to the engineer in the way that maybe they had wanted to do. So you kind of just push back the problem of like the design of the machines. You can say, oh, these all the different organisms that we see today are not themselves designed, but the sort of basic molecular machinery that allows for the production of proteins based on a DNA template, that itself was designed. So yeah, you're sort of like displacing the problem rather than getting rid of it.
He doesn't seem to pursue this point because the next paragraph starts with him saying, in any case. But after he says that if, the 1 to 4 sequence is a mechanical operation, then he then says, and dismisses that idea as childish. He then says, if on the contrary, with the facts, that each nested system differs qualitatively. The nesting system differs qualitatively from the nested systems, so that there's a qualitative difference, conscious intention in the psychological set. It says we'll have a means of glimpsing through kind of extrapolation nature frames the activity of man and all beings. So that doesn't seem to be something that he's rejecting. He seems to be saying that if we don't see 1 through 4 as entirely mechanistic, we can still do this kind of like superset extrapolation, but one that passes through qualitative differences at each stage. It's a very interesting and strange suggestion, though. Shoot.
Yeah, I think it was okay. Yeah, we there was a little bit of cutting out, but I think I think I was able to get everything. I'm just sort of going through this bit again. So I think the idea here is that so in the sort of they're not that like sort of sophisticated examples, like the one where with like trying to get to a location as fast as you can, and this is sort of like the general. This is like the 1-4 part of the chain, and then the 2-3 part is pressing on the accelerator of the car, and the car goes fast. So here you have this sort of qualitative distinction in the sense that the 1-4 parts of the chain are related to the psychological or this conscious goal setting and decision making, and then the 2-3 parts are mechanical. But you can, of course, insert the 1 to 4 in a bigger chain, 0 to 5, and that might sort of make it mechanical. Like if you have, I don't know, like if you're a traffic engineer designing the road system of the city and setting up the traffic lights and so on, then you are sort of treating each of the individual drivers as like components of your system, and you will, set things up so that they will behave in certain ways. And so the individual driver who has this goal of getting home as fast as possible is sort of made to function as a component of this system. But then again, you can insert that chain where the traffic engineer is the external consciousness into, I don't know, maybe like the planning of the city as a whole, where the traffic engineer is just one component of the overall urban planning system, and et cetera. You can just sort of keep going back and forth, like sort of nesting a machine inside a consciousness, inside a machine, inside a consciousness, et cetera. And I think the idea here is that like we can sort of take our own, like if you just take a human being in general as like this entity that is, conscious and capable of setting goals for itself and so on, then you can sort of extrapolate and suggest that there might be a machine within which human beings, as these beings that have this kind of autonomy, would be framed. So yeah, it's a kind of extrapolation from the fact that you can keep doing this sort of alternating nesting between machines and consciousness. You can suppose that even at the most sort of external consciousness level that we can suppose of ourselves, then there would be some other machine outside that, and presumably also another, I guess, something analogous to consciousness. So probably not exactly the same as consciousness in the case of human beings, but presumably this alternation just keeps going as many times, many iterations as you wanted to. So Bats put here, would the man in the middle example be an example of a machine itself trained by an engineer, which involves inside a human that inside this framing is itself having to make decisions and frame other problems for its operations inside the machine. Yeah, so like you can, if you only focus on, if you zoom into like the human in this radar operator example, like you ignore everything about how the radar device actually operates, reflecting electromagnetic waves and so on. Like you could train a radar operator without any, like the radar operator has never actually seen like the dish and everything outside that is actually making this radar work. You just train them that if you see this dot, then press this button, and if you see a dot that does this, press this other button. So the whole like functioning of this system of the radar operator sitting inside the control room is just a sort of task of like recognizing what these dots on a screen are doing, and you don't even have to tell them that certain types of dot behavior represent a plane, and certain other types of dot behavior represent a flock of geese. You just sort of train them to do one thing in one situation and something else in a different situation. So for this person, the goal is like, I don't know, doing what my commanding officer tells me to do so that I don't get disciplined as in the military. And as a sort of sub goal to achieve that goal, it's I'm gonna watch these dots as well as I can and press the right button. And so you could have a sort of goal and decision making sort of process going on in the case of this person, staring at the screen. But then if you zoom out a little bit, then of course that goal and decision making is actually itself incorporated in the functioning of this machine, where the person is sort of like replaceable by a part, like another mechanism, that instead of having a person looking at the screen and identifying the dots behavior, you could have some sort of device that would take in signals coming from the radar and determine whether it's a bomber plane or a flock of geese. So each of like the question of like machine versus consciousness is partly a question of scale, like where are you zooming in, and like how much of the chain is actually incorporated in the frame that you're including.
Seems like for Ruyer, even in the case of the man, there would be a difference in, like, even if the man is a sort of perfect radio operator, shows up, is very, very good at picking out the dots, the kind of dot that he needs to pick out. There would still be this what he refers to as a translation from axiological into geometrical space going on for the model employee radio operator, which would in principle never happen for the machines that he is situated in between.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Maybe the difference here is that before this radar operator becomes this, ideal radar operator who never makes a mistake and never gets tired and whatever, before all that happens, this person is actually a human being that, has decided to join the military or been conscripted or whatever, that has, learned how to read, has done all kinds of other things, and, presumably also at the end of the shift goes home and, like, I don't know, does something other than staring at dots on a radar screen. So like this is a person who has like been trained and trained themselves to perform this task. So that they've like out of all the many different things that they are capable of doing, or maybe would have been capable of learning how to do, they have ended up through whatever circumstances, becoming a radar operator that has this skill. Whereas in the case of these, like if you replace the radar operator by, some sort of device that, analyzes the incoming signal and detects whether it's a enemy plane coming in, this device is like sort of purpose built for this one function, or potentially, maybe you have a few different functions that this maybe you have like a general purpose computer that analyzes all sorts of incoming signals, not just radar signals, but many other kinds of signals. But in any case, you have like a device that is sort of set up to perform either this specific function or a certain class of functions, and your device doesn't, go home and watch TV afterwards, or have a conversation with its friends or whatever. It's something that doesn't have. I mean, we use the term like having a life. You say like your colleagues have a life outside of work, but here this is like in the very literal sense. The machine doesn't have a life outside of detecting whether the radar signal indicates an incoming enemy plane, whereas the human operator does have a life. Even the most like dedicated and sort of most the sort of like ideal employee, doesn't literally sit at the radar screen 24 hours a day. At minimum, they have to go home and sleep, and then they probably have dreams and so on. So all these different sort of there's all kinds of things that make the human operator not purely a component of the machine, of the whole sort of chain of machines, in contrast to the device that replaces the human operator. And this is partly, in these types of situations, partly what makes the replacement appealing to the people who are designing these processes is, that you don't have to worry that maybe this device will decide not to obey orders, or that it will get tired and make the wrong decision or whatever, precisely because the device doesn't have a life outside of performing this detection function. It sort of minimizes the risk that it will not perform that detection function the way you expect it to.
Yeah, I think at least as I understand what he's seems like, even if you had like radar operator in like, let's say like, I don't know, there's a like automation in the next room over, there's a mechanical device that has like taken the job of his previous coworker, and like they're doing exactly the same thing at the same time. I think that Ruyer would still say like there's axiological in the operation of in the pure, like even if they output exactly the same data, there would still be the like an axiological depth to the experience of human radar that just wouldn't be there for the machine that had replaced the other one.
Yeah, you can imagine like, suppose you have one radar power is being operated by the human who's looking at the screen and detecting, seeing if the dots look like an incoming plane or not. And then the other one, the next room over is there's a computer that's doing the same thing. It's possible that the human would say like identify other patterns that had not been sort of assigned to them, that like, oh, I noticed that like every day after 4 p.m. there's like something that looks like a flock of geese, but then turns out to be a plane. So like maybe the enemy Air Force is like trying to trick us, or on this like regular pattern or whatever. I don't know, I'm making something up. It doesn't necessarily make any sense to like someone who actually knows about how radar works. But the idea is that like the human is not just detecting, it's not just performing this task, plane versus flock of geese, but they can, just by virtue of the fact that they have this life outside of that one task, they can potentially learn something different about the pattern of information coming in, and identify something that that they were not assigned to identify, or that they like were not told this to watch for. Whereas the computer, all the same information is coming in, but it doesn't have any life outside of that discrimination task of like plane or not a plane. Um, so anything that doesn't sort of contribute towards like identifying plain versus not plain is just discarded. Um, and uh, and depending on how much other information or what other input that person is receiving, they might have like thoughts about whether this is a good place to set up a radar tower. And like if they sit there and like they only ever detect geese, they never once detect a plane, they might say, okay, this is like probably not a great location for a radar tower, and maybe like my job here is not that useful. Whereas the computer is happy to just output not a plane as many times as you need it to. So like yeah, just the sort of possibility of learning something or coming up with an idea of like whether this is a useful thing to be doing, etc. Like all these things are even when like for temporarily the input output function might be the same in both cases. Like they might be performing the same discrimination task and having the same results. The human can learn something from the longer term pattern of whether the dots turn out to be geese or planes, whereas the computer, unless you actually like tell it to do that, will not sort of try to learn anything or make any use of that information. I guess could you expand on that in your comment here in the chat, just like on Mike?
Yeah, I think that it seems like there's like even if there's nothing learned, like no difference in output between the human and the machine, it seems like there's like even if you could completely unrealistically have a human being whose performance was entirely identical to the machine for his entire career, and never like really maybe they weren't much of a learner and picked up on anything. I think it would still be a difference in kind for Ruyer. But in what exactly that difference consists, other than a kind of hyperspatial grasp of axiological space, still something I'm trying to get my arms.
Yeah, I think in this example of like say the person who like just sits there and like every single instance of the goose versus plane detection task is like completely independent, never learns anything about the pattern of what time of day the planes appear or whatever, anything like that. And like I think Ruyer might see this as a kind of like mechanization of the person. The person has just sort of turned themselves into a machine, as opposed to like there being a difference between the computer next door and the person doing this. And to some extent, like what happens in training someone to be a soldier, to operate a radar installation or whatever, is turning someone into a machine. That like sometimes I mean the radar operator might learn certain things about the pattern of planes coming in, but sometimes you don't want them to actually try to think about what they're doing. You just want them to do this one task and feed the information up to someone else who will make that decision. And yeah, sometimes having the person making a decision, it can be dangerous if they are missing other information that they that would be relevant, that they don't have access to. And so for precisely that reason, you want them to just sort of mechanically make that identification of plain or not plain, and not try to make decisions about like whether there's a pattern in terms of when the planes appear and so on. So yeah, I think to the extent if you can suppose that the human and computer performance are the same, that would be an instance of a human sort of mechanizing themselves or being made into a machine. Whether it's through like training process in the military or like some sort of monastic discipline or whatever it is. And I think to the extent that there is a difference, it would always go along with the fact that the human could always decide to quit the military, even if that means being executed for desertion or whatever, or decide I don't want to be a monk that recites this verse over and over again every day. Whatever it is, that the human, no matter how sort of mechanized they have become, can always sort of make a decision to change the machines that they have set up their life to be, and set up different machines instead. Whereas, of course, the computer is not going to decide to desert the military, no matter how much you sort of kick it or mistreat it or whatever. When we were talking like a few weeks or maybe a couple months ago now about like this sort of like sci-fi fantasy about like the android that like is supposed to be this like perfect servant that will never rebel. Like as soon as you see as like in any like sci-fi thing, they're like, oh, this computer is designed so that it will never rebel. Like immediately that that computer is going to rebel. Like that like this sort of idea that like I think like this sort of capacity to not just fulfill a particular preset function, but to decide not to fulfill that function, and even like we were talking about in the case of like a draft animal, the horse can just decide, I'm done pulling this plow. I've been doing it for years. It's boring. You can whip me or refuse to feed me or whatever. I'm just not going to pull the plow. And that's just something that yeah. So that's just something that animals sometimes do. They just whatever, like you can sort of use the training, like training as a kind of mechanization of the animal. It's like setting the animal up to perform this task in a reliable way, so that you can achieve a certain goal. But every once in a while that machine just fails because the animal decides it doesn't want to do what you thought it should do. And this is sort of like the difference between the machines that we design for ourselves and then these like self-producing machines that are animals, because they're never fully machines. They're never sort of identical to the machine that they become, because they're always capable of demechanizing themselves, I guess, in some sense. They can, the machine that they turn into is not sort of final or definitive. They can always not be that machine and be some other machine in whatever circumstance. Okay, so we can go on to the next bit, which I think this time should actually take us to the end of the chapter. Think we were on page 57. Is that right? In any case, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
In any case, there must be a frame 0 to 5, which may itself be complex for the whole system of human or organic activity. The animal or man is not an absolute beginning. Tendencies or wills oriented by valences or values, which contain subordinate functions, are themselves enveloped contents. Living beings are not the fabrications of a demiurge or a great engineer who would endow them with a certain number of sensitivities or, quote, variable needs, unquote, in the same way that the engineer arbitrarily gives to his automaton, quote unquote, sensitivity to light or to charge or to the charge level of his battery. But in a more subtle sense, living beings are, quote unquote, creatures, quote unquote, axiological automata, created and quote unquote framed by a transcendent who fixes their nature and the values to which they are sensitive. These values or valences control their actions by a kind of axiological feedback similar but not reducible to the mechanical feedback of automata. Something in animal instincts is imitable by machines. It is possible to make artificial animals that flee from the sight of a cane like a dog, that head for a heat source like a bug, that swim against the current like a migratory fish, that walk in a line like processionary caterpillars. But obviously, something in divine art is more subtle than the art of the engineer. The valences that drive instincts, and especially the values that drive human behavior, are not reducible to physiological or even psychological mechanical assemblies, which are there to process them. When a man sets himself an elevated goal, an ideal difficult to achieve in art, morality, or techniques, his actions are also controlled at every moment according to the results already achieved by comparison with the ideal sought. Basically, the situation is the same as when Elmer and Elsie, Gray Walter's automatic tortoises, move toward moderate light. But it would be too paradoxical to reduce axiological feedback to mechanical feedback. Living beings are at the same time in physical space and in an axiological space. Psychophysiological assemblies and already brains as observable apparatuses are only projections on geometric space of a reality that overflows them. Visible feedback is only a quote-unquote degenerate, in the sense that physicists use this word, state of axiological feedback. As is already the case with an animal disobeying its instincts, a man who disobeys the ideal that usually keeps him in check is worried, troubled, and dissatisfied. This dissatisfaction can hardly be considered as the epiphenomenon of the oscillatory movements that bring the behavioral effectors back to normal equilibrium. The discomfort one feels when leaving one's axiological path can hardly be equated to the pounding felt under the soles of the feet when one has left one's geodesic space-time and feels, quote-unquote, lead-footed. The strength of an ideal is not reducible to force in the physical sense. It is even the exact opposite. Force in the physical sense is only a statistical appearance of elementary axiological forces. As often happens in the psychological order, it is the higher order action that must give the model of explanation for the elementary action, and not the other way around. An artist who lacks the taste to judge himself and his own productions could not progress toward his aesthetic ideal. Taste, or value judgment in general, has exactly the same function in higher acts as sensory information in elementary acts. A quote, ethically colorblind, unquote, person, a man suffering from axiological blindness, doesn't know how to regulate his actions, just as a blind person or a Tibetic doesn't know how to regulate his movement. It is in another transspatial world that man and already animals seeks regulatory information. It is impossible to conceive of a machine capable of regulating and informing itself by value judgment. We can metaphorically, in a mind game, imagine all the efforts of humanity in all areas throughout its history as a vast set of feedback actions in which invisible, and indeed poorly defined and changing, ideals control the already achieved results at every moment. This metaphor is not without value, but it is obviously only a metaphor. Quote, regulation by value, unquote, is something is something more than a mechanical regulation. People who fear the mechanization of humanity through technology seem to believe that, for example, automobiles, through the power of improvement, will first have automatic steering, then will be able to follow a road on their own according to a program, allowing the owner to stay at home while their car travels. They will then be able to choose their own route according to the roads indicated as scenic by a guide. Then they will be able to explore the roads and determine which are scenic by themselves. These fears are entirely childish precisely because if axiological feedback is similar to mechanical feedback, it is also essentially different, and above all, it envelops the latter. Something transcendent in man and beyond man will always frame his industrial machines or his physiological machines. Yeah, so this is an interesting thing about obviously in 1958 or whenever this was written, the prospect of a self-driving car was like not even on the horizon. Whereas today there, of course, are ongoing research projects trying to implement this, so they are not quite as straightforward as people kind of expected them to be about 10 years ago. But even assuming that, like, say, this self-driving car, driving through traffic function is implemented, we're still a long way from cars touring the landscape to decide which routes are scenic. Yeah, it's funny when this like sort of it's similar to Simondon in some senses, where you have this like very detailed analysis of like the design of this artificial tortoise, and then like a few pages later you have this like sort of metaphysical extrapolation that like it's kind of a wild ride from like here's what a vacuum tube looks like, and I'm gonna explain the development of vacuum tubes in excruciating detail, and then like to sort of like pronouncements about the nature of reality and so on. But yeah, so the idea here, I think, this axiological regulation, or I think the idea here, like what distinguishes this axiological regulation from the mechanical regulation, is that it's not sort of preset in the same way that the mechanical one is. So even in the case of these devices like the tortoise that have a certain flexibility of behavior, that like they don't sort of, you don't have to tell the tortoise this is the exact location where the charging station is. The tortoise can navigate towards the charging station using the light source, no matter where that light source and charging station are. So there's a certain amount of flexibility. It's not like preset in that sense, but at the same time, this functioning of orienting towards the light source is preset. But in the case of a human being that is sort of oriented toward a value, so in some sense it's similar to the orienting toward the light source, but like writing a great novel, for example, is not if that's like your goal that you set yourself, I'm going to write a great novel. This is something that is like, well, for one sense, it's for one thing, it's much more vague than orienting toward the light source, because like what are the properties of a great novel is not something you can sort of just set out a list of this is what constitutes a great novel. But at the same time, I think maybe it's also different because like you are partly like inventing what it is to be a great novel at the same time as you're doing it, right? Like the tortoise is not inventing how to navigate towards the light source, whereas like part of what makes a novel a great novel, as opposed to just like a competently executed novel, is the fact that it sort of reinvents what a novel is. that like before this novel was written, no one else would have had the thought of writing a novel in this way, and so this like axiological regulation is not sort of oriented towards something that already exists in at least in potential, like this sort of direction towards a light source. It's like sort of transforming its own landscape as it progresses, and so I think this is maybe this is related to that quality of I guess flexibility in the case of like the radar operator who could decide I'm going to desert from the military. Um, this person who spent 50 years staring at a radar screen and being the best radar operator ever, on the 51st year could decide, I've done my time as a radar operator. I'm going to desert from the military and write a novel instead. So this is something that yeah, there's always this capacity to sort of transform the I don't know, pattern or structure of the activity of this what was a machine, like this radar operator is a machine in the sort of military system, but that machine can also sort of transform itself into something different and set up this different machine based on some sort of maybe not even fully conscious goal or value that the person is trying to realize.
Yeah, this is a really interesting end of the chapter, and one thing I've been thinking about is whether the axiological goal for Ruyer, whether he thinks it needs to be something that is, distinct and that can, the human being can represent to themselves, or whether it could be something that is orienting and yet also vague or indistinct. For Kant in the Critique of Judgment, the genius doesn't have a clear concept of the work of art that is being produced, and can't in a way in order to be. And so yeah, I'm just wondering if Ruyer would, I guess if he thinks there needs to be something like axiological space. And actually, I mean, obviously, Deleuze is heavily influenced by Ruyer, but he, in Difference and Repetition, the problem, which really I think is Ruyer's virtual, can be created by like the condensation of singularities, which I think of, for instance, as like Cezanne trying to figure out how he is going to liberate these formal elements of painting from representation. One singularity could be like the use of blank canvas or unpainted space in the kind of field of the entire painting. I guess could be an instance of a singularity condensed in this process of forming the problem, which is Cezanne painting in his own style. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if Ruyer directly addresses.
Yeah, I'm not sure if he actually explicitly talks about this, but the way I would think about it is, I mean, maybe something a little less like this concept of sort of genius and so on. There's a lot of other elements going into it, but like I think if we make it something less sort of I don't know, dramatic, we can just talk about like if the value that you're trying to realize is being a friend. Being a friend, there are certain like you can sort of like have rules, but you can like I'm sure there's books about like how to be a good friend that you could read or whatever. But like obviously being someone's friend can't be sort of reduced to like just do these 6 things and therefore you're a good friend or whatever. Like part of what it is to be someone's friend is to like have this capacity to adapt to that person's needs and like help that person with whatever they're dealing with and so on, like have this sort of flexibility and openness and that you learn from each other and grow together and so on. Like this I think this is sort of characteristic of this like axiological regulation that like it's not reducible to like a sort of set of success criteria in a way that a mechanical regulation would be. Even a very sophisticated one like a ChatGPT type of system that like you want it like if you at the sort of broad level or a very high level description, it's like the goal is to like generate text that is like fits certain criteria that the user enters at the prompt. This like you can sort of evaluate this. The evaluation might be somewhat vague in terms of like whether people think this text meets the criteria that the prompt had assigned to it. There could be varying opinions on that, but in principle, this is like a sort of closed task. It's like the user enters a prompt and the system outputs a text that is supposed to match this prompt. Whereas the being a friend is a much more open-ended project where it's not just that like if the person you want to be a friend to does X, then you should do Y. And so I think this is like characteristic of this kind of axiological regulation. It has this open-ended quality to it, in that like you as the person who is regulating yourself in accordance with a value will undergo a transformation of some kind, like as part of like that regulation itself, rather than just sort of like following these steps or meeting these criteria to achieve this goal. And this applies also, of course, to all the the sort of genius type examples that you can't like tell someone if you do these 5 things then your novel will be great. Like you can give people like tips for like how to increase your chance of writing a great novel, or to the things you can avoid that will definitely make your novel not great. But you can't like give someone a formula for how to write a great novel. Yeah, the whole like self-help industry of like sort of giving you these like lists of things that you can do to become the perfect mother or the perfect employee or whatever. These these are kind of like missing the point of what it is to like being a mother. Obviously is not something you can just say like these it requires these criteria to be fulfilled, and then you've like done your due diligence and you can like sit back and watch TV the rest of the time. Whatever, all these different things that involve like this relation to a value, they require a kind of openness to reevaluating whether you have whether what you're doing is actually getting you to what you want to do, and maybe you have to like rethink your whole approach to being a mother or being a friend or writing a novel or whatever it is. Like maybe you have to throw out your whole draft that you spent like 3 years working on because you decide this is actually terrible. I'm gonna start from zero. So yeah, sometimes you do have to transform what you're doing, or sometimes it's just making an adjustment of some kind that like I was treating my friend in this way, but then I've come to realize that that was not sort of respectful in this sense because of some other factor. So I'm going to treat my friend in a different way to try to be a better friend. Just making these little adjustments sometimes is also part of what it is to act in accordance with the value of being a friend. This transformation can be a sort of like a fundamental rethinking and reorientation of your whole life, but it can also be like just these little adjustments, or you're writing a novel and you think, oh, actually this chapter, I like what I wrote, but it doesn't really fit, so I'm gonna have to take it out. Just making these adjustments, and making things sort of fit together in a better way is also part of that same kind of transformation process. Okay, so we are at the end of the chapter and almost at the sort of approaching the 2-hour mark, so we can stop here and pick up next time. So we will interrupt our reading group machine for the moment, and we will orient ourselves towards the value of continuing discussion of the book next session. So thank you everyone for Thank you everyone for joining today and for your contributions, and